So earlier in the third 9 weeks, we spent two chapters in the building up of empires. And in this chapter, we're basically just going to go ahead and tear it all apart. The building of empire is going to be a much slower process than the end of empire. However, both of them are going to have extremely profound consequences, not only for the countries that built empire, but the countries who were part of empire. And some of those repercussions we're still going to be dealing with today. But in general, decolonization was vastly important in the second half of the 20th century. These newly independent states are going to experiment economically, politically, and also culturally. You also want to take a second here and put a note here next to number one. You want to put down, please, that they had to experiment. They had to experiment because the Europeans who they were dependent on either left or were thrown out. One of the things that you will see throughout this chapter is the end of empire oftentimes is very abrupt. There's going to be a number of instances where the European countries basically, slap their empire in the butt and say, hey, good game, and bail on them. And now you have these countries that haven't governed themselves independently in more than a century and honestly have never governed themselves in the way that they exist at that time. So there's going to be a lot of struggles with it. In other cases, the Europeans will be kicked out very, very abruptly. And again, in a lot of ways, the newly independent empires are kind of mucking around and trying to figure out exactly what is going to work for them. Because of this scenario, these states face enormous challenges. You want to put down here next to number two, then, you want to put that these challenges are linked to imperialism. I mean, at the end of the day, all of these struggles that these countries have at this time, and in most cases continue to have even the present day, those issues can be traced back to the problems created because of imperialism. And these challenges are going to be everything from divisions of language, ethnicity, race, and class, because remember, these countries were arbitrarily created in order to suit the ends and the needs of the Europeans. They really didn't give a toss about those that are within those colonies. So there's going to be a lot of struggle with that. They're also going to have to deal with rapidly growing populations. They're going to have to work towards stable politics and modern economies, oftentimes with very little knowledge about how to do either. Because again, for so long, they had been so dependent upon the Western powers. And then on top of this, they're having to deal with the influences of the industrialized nations. Now, even though these Western nations will have abandoned them or be kicked out in some cases from any type of imperial or colonial control, that doesn't mean that there still isn't some manipulation going on at the hands of those former imperial masters. One of the things that you will see is a lot of these independent movements kind of all come a little bit of a cluster or in a little bit of a cluster. Like, for example, India, Pakistan, Burma, Indonesia, Iraq, Jordan, Israel are all going to win their independence in the late 1940s. Now, a lot of this including even some of the African independence movements that come between the mid 50s to the mid 1970s, are all a response to World War II. A lot of it is, the vibe of World War II was to fight tyranny. So, how can you spend all those resources and lose all those lives to fight tyranny while you still are engaged in the tyrannical activity of imperialism? And really, the bare bones is that empire is expensive to maintain. And don't forget the level of destruction that World War II reaps on the European economies. I mean, these guys are still struggling with the consequences or the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression. Then, boom, you have the expense of World War II. So, a lot of these European countries just simply can't afford to foot the bill anymore. Now, the catch here is that imperial breakup isn't anything new. The novelty here was the mobilization of the masses. And in fact, you want to put here a star by number one, because not only are we mobilizing the masses, but we're mobilizing them around a nationalist ideology and the creation of a large number of new nation states. The fact that empires rise and fall is sort of kind of just one of those history things. But the fact that we have these groups mobilizing around these very nationalist ideas, which, if you remember from one of the first chapters on imperialism, was one of the emotions that got the Europeans to build empire in the first place. Because remember, in order to be one of those great nations, you had to have a great empire. And the fact that now these former empires are taking that same vibe, and then we're also creating so many new nation states, really sets this period apart from other ends of empires. And really, we have a lot of empires that are falling in the 20th century. Like, for example, in the aftermath of World War I, we have the Austrian and Ottoman empires going. We have the Russian Empire that collapses, but in reality, all we're really kind of doing is renaming it the Soviet Union or the USSR. You also have the German and Japanese empires that are ending with World War II, and the African and Asian independence movements are going to be shared with other end of empire stories with the idea of self determination. Now, there is something that I need you to do here. You want to underline self determination. And then next to self determination, even just go, because this is a note specific for this, just put a little arrow over to the side. And you want to put, please, here that self determination is a common theme for most end of empires. Self determination is a common theme for most end of empires. What self determination is that it just means that these guys don't want to be part of an empire anymore. They want to be independent. They either want to create their own nation, or they just simply don't want to be part of whatever empire they are. And this is something that you're going to see kind of throughout this entire period. And even before, with earlier forms of breakdown of empire. Think, all the way back a couple chapters when the Spanish Empire starts to fall apart in the early part of the 1900s, or sorry, early part of the 19th century, rather. Now, the last part of this section is going to be explaining African and Asian independence. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more in more detail here later on in the chapter. But there's several explanations for decolonization that have emerged that I want to make sure I touch on. First is the emphasis on the fundamental contradictions of the colonial enterprise. You want to put down here next to A, underneath number 2, you want to put down the hypocrisy of imperialism. And we talked about this, one of the first chapters with building empire is as the Europeans in the 19th century is starting to demand more and more rights at home, the Europeans are also going abroad and conquering people and depriving them of similar natural and basic rights that the Europeans want more of. On top of this, and I mentioned this before, you have World War II that's being fought against tyranny and against tyrannical dictatorial powers. Well, you can't fight an entire war against that, but then you pretty much have that same vibe going on within your empires. Europeans are also going to use the idea of conjuncture to explain the timing of decolonization. Underneath conjuncture, actually, you want to go ahead and underline conjuncture and then just draw a little arrow over to the side or wherever it is you're going to put. You want to put down that this is a combination. This is a combination of events or circumstances. A combination of events or circumstances. And I would just put in parentheses a perfect storm. A perfect storm. So a lot of historians are arguing that, there's just sort of kind of a perfect set of situations that allows decolonization to occur when this happens. And then you want to put down at the bottom of the page, because I know your page one ends after B, you want to put down at the bottom of the page that some scholars emphasize the role of specific groups and individuals. Again, you want to put that at the bottom of your page one. Some scholars emphasize the role of specific groups and individuals. I mean, one of the common themes that you're going to see is that independence was contested pretty much everywhere. We have independence efforts are usually not cohesive movements of uniformly oppressed people. You're going to see that, some of these movements are going to be similar to each other. Some of these movements are going to be vastly different, but the end result of independence is going to be the same. What you're also going to see, and this is going to cause us some problems later on that we'll see even in the next chapter, and even in this one as well, is that fragile coalitions of conflicting groups and parties are going to occur. What ultimately here, and you want to put down next to B underneath 3, that these can break apart at any time. These can break apart at any time. One of the things that you'll see here is that you have these amazingly diverse groups who have a common interest in gaining freedom. But then as soon as they have freedom, they don't know what direction that they want to go into afterwards. So a lot of times there's a lot of infighting, and you'll see there's going to be some long-term consequences for that disorganization.